Alright guys, Valentine's Day is just around the corner, exactly a month from today, and I was going to put together a video on rose fragrances because roses are perfect. Rose fragrances are perfect for Valentine's Day, and I thought I'd come up with a different theme on this particular year's roses fragrances video. Today I'm doing a Chypre roses fragrances. So these are top 20 rose Chypre fragrances or floral Chypre fragrances, and I'm going to let you know what they are coming right up. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Sebastian. Yeah, Valentine's Day is just around the corner. I just got back recently and it's almost, you know, another holiday around the corner. I left on Christmas Day. I spent Christmas and New Year's in the UK. So now we're getting ready for Valentine's Day. And this is a rose themed video, but this is rose Chypre fragrances. If you don't know what Chypre fragrances are, they basically are, it stands for Cyprus, but not necessarily the tree, but this is the island. And typically Chypre fragrances will feature bergamot, labdanum, and oakmoss. But in this case, we've got a lot of patchouli as well, because that's typically found in Chypre fragrances as well. And then in this case, we're doing roses. So it's roses, patchouli, oakmoss. With the whole IFRA regulations on oakmoss and things like that, some of these fragrances will probably feature oakmoss with tiny amounts of it. They use patchouli kind of to substitute for oakmoss as well. And I love patchouli and I love rose together, and I think the combination really works wonderfully. If you are a fan of Chypre fragrances, let me know what they are and what fragrances you enjoy is what I should say. And also if you love rose Chypre fragrances, let me know what they are. And also as I'm going through the video today of the different fragrances, do let me know if you're a fan of either of the fragrances. But we're going to start at 20 with Patchouli Light here from the house of Hermetica. This is a brand that doesn't really get talked too much about, and this one is rose patchouli oakmoss with sandalwood and iris. It's a bit powdery. It's definitely got the earthy touches, and I feel like Chypre fragrances definitely go earthy because I find oakmoss and patchouli to be fairly earthy notes in general, so a lot of the fragrances will experience that way. But the rose in here will add that kind of jamminess, the brightness, and perhaps there's a little bergamot in here as well, but it definitely has woodiness and powderiness as well. The cool thing about Hermetica fragrances is you can rub it all in. It's moisturizing, and they're usually not in the top heart notes breakdown. It's like linear notes, so you're not going to burn the top notes and things like that, and definitely very moisturizing fragrances. Moving on to the house of CHANTECAILLE, this is DARBY Rose. This to me is such a bright rose fragrance. It also has very classic rose touches. Reminds me of rose fragrances my dad used to bring back from Bulgaria. These oils that I remember when he traveled there, he'd bring back from my mom, and I'd be like very curious with smells. The rose in here does remind me of that, but it's definitely once again a Chypre, but going in a different direction. It's got rose magnolia, it's got osmanthus lemons with cassis, raspberry, patchouli, ambrette, and sandalwood. So it's got some earthy touches for sure. Definitely has to have it, but of course it has some fruitiness and some citrusy touches as well. We get the fruitiness from the cassis and the osmanthus, light leatheriness, and then of course musky, woody touches as well. DARBY Rose, that's the only fragrance I have from that brand here that I'll ever talk about. But they do have some really great fragrances. They have skincare as well, but they're mostly known for their skincare. But they have some pretty solid fragrances, like one of their amber fragrances, Kalimantan is a really great amber fragrance. But moving on to the house of Christian Louboutin, we've got two fragrances from this house that are rose Chypre fragrances. This is the first one, LOUBIFUNK, this one right here. This to me is a fruity rose Chypre. Definitely has lots of black currant here with rose and patchouli. This to me also is very easy to wear. The fruitiness kind of makes for fragrances to be very easy. Sometimes Chypre fragrances might be a little overwhelming to some of you, so if you are overwhelmed with fragrances, check this one out. Definitely has that kind of juicy fruitiness from the blackcurrant, a bit green as well, and then you've got the rose, of course, the jamminess of the rose and patchouli, but definitely not a heavy fragrance to me. It's LOUBIFUNK from the house of Christian Louboutin. Stay tuned for the next, or the second fragrance from that house. But moving on to the house of Floral Street, it's Chypre Sublime or Sublime. This is a pretty pretty underrated house as well from the UK, and I kind of like their flowers that are all over their bottles. And this one definitely is a solid fragrance. It kind of reminds me of Portrait of a Lady. It could be a great alternative for Portrait of a Lady. But it's incense with pink pepper, there's wild geranium, damask rose. And for me, it's got those touches. It's a little different, but definitely it's in that same ballpark. Don't worry, Portrait of a Lady is on this list as well, but not all the fragrances that are on this list remind us of Portrait of a Lady. They're definitely the rose chypre style, but they're going to go in different directions. Not everything is going to smell the same, but this one definitely gets close, and I think it's a great alternative and a great smelling, rose chypre fragrance. So this is Chypre Sublime from the house of Floral Street. Moving on to the house of Givenchy. This is Accord Particulier, this one right here. This is an underrated collection. This is the Givenchy collection Particulier fragrances is what it's called. They have two different names. There's a second set of fragrances that is called the Hotel Particulier. This is called Accord Particulier. It's a rose chypre in the end. You can wear it on its own minimalistically with ambroxan here, and I like that ambroxan muskiness in this particular fragrance, and you've got the addition of the rose and also the patchouli, plus there's also vetiver in this. You can also use this to layer their other fragrances to kind of make your own unique mix, kind of become a mixologist or something, and to enhance some fragrances and to, you know, take them into different directions and things like that. On its own, it's quite nice. It's definitely an ambroxan forward rose chypre fragrance. So Accord Particulier is at number 16. So up next, going to the house of Tom Ford, it's Rose Prick. Rose Prick, definitely a rose chypre. And this is definitely one of their X-rated fragrances, the series of X-rated fragrances they did. This one to me is pretty solid in comparison to the other fragrances, including the FF, and then of course Lost Cherry, and of course they have the new cherries, which is definitely not necessarily part of the X-rated collection. But this Rose Prick is pretty solid with the multiple types of roses here that are featured here. You've got Bulgarian rose, you've got Turkish rose, you've got May rose. You also have some Sichuan pepper, there's turmeric, and there's some patchouli. The Sichuan pepper adds some lemoniness in this particular fragrance, spiciness, pepperiness, and of course the earthiness from the patchouli. I quite like this one. It's definitely solid. It's at number 15, but I've got a second Tom Ford, which is way at the top, and I'll let you know what that is coming up. But moving on to the house of Juliet Has a Gun, it's Vengeance Extreme. You know, I've never really gotten into Vengeance. They have a fragrance, I think it's called Lady Vengeance, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have that fragrance, but this one actually to me is really, really great for a great inexpensive sort of chypre fragrance. If you're into the idea of a chypre with roses and patchouli and things like that, definitely check this one out. And I should also say, chypre fragrances do have a classic quality about them, so you must be into the idea of more classic fragrances. At least to me, they come off classic. But this is definitely very, very solid, and a great fragrance from Juliet Has a Gun, whereas a lot of their fragrances seem to be kind of molecular. They like to use molecular notes. Here we're going backwards into like the classics and things like that. So Vengeance Extreme at number 14. Moving on to the house of Sisley, we've got two fragrances from this house. This is Isia La Nuit, this one right here, with a really, really beautiful bottle. The first fragrance in this series was definitely a very fresh, bright, summery rose. Here we go into the dark territory, into the chypre genre of fragrances, and definitely a rose chypre. Of course, you've got rose here, patchouli, blackcurrant, cardamom, freesia, amber, and ambroxan. And the ambroxan in this is not as noticeable as the ambroxan in the Givenchy Accord Particulier. Here, it's kind of hidden in the background. It's there to kind of like prolong the life of the fragrance rather than to kind of like be the star note and that kind of thing with this particular fragrance. But it's definitely very, very earthy and rosy, jammy, and some fruitiness and some spices come in as well. So this is Isia La Nuit at number 13. Very underrated house, I have to say. Where is that next fragrance? Here it is. I should say it's underrated, but they have really great skincare, and I've used their skincare, and I really do agree that the skincare is really, really great, but nobody really talks about their fragrances, which is kind of odd. But moving on to the house of Pierre Guillaume, it's Isparta. Here we go, that's something kind of similar to Portrait of a Lady once again. And again, it's not identical, we're kind of going into that same ballpark of spicy patchouli rose, but this particular fragrance definitely has an addition of lots of red fruits, whereas Portrait of a Lady had it as well. But we've got red fruits here, Turkish rose, we've got balsamic notes of Peru balsam, calamus, patchouli, frankincense, benzoin, oud, ambroxan, and musk. It's a great fragrance. It's definitely in the style of Pierre Guillaume fragrances. It's a different take on something like Portrait of a Lady. Definitely very, very Chypre, very earthy, very rosy and spicy. So it's Isparta from the house of Pierre Guillaume at number 12. So up next, going to the house of Christian Louboutin once again. This is LOUBIFUNK, this one right here. So this is another collection in this series of fragrances that are more intense fragrances, and definitely this is the darker Chypre fragrance in comparison to the LOUBIFUNK, as I was saying earlier, whereas that one's fruity. Here we've got the more darker notes. We've got some incense thrown in. There's some smokiness here with the rose. There's definitely aromatic touches from geranium, which really complements the rose in this one to create a little more of a boost of a rose aromatic mintiness. And then of course the earthy patchouli comes in. Most likely a lot of these fragrances that don't mention Oakmoss, that are categorized as Chypre fragrances, do feature probably minute amounts of it, just the amount that you are allowed to use, because IFRA has regulated the amount of Oakmoss you can use in these fragrances, and perhaps it's very low, they don't list it, but for me this really acts like an actual Chypre, whereas you have the kind of oak mossy touches, and then of course the patchouli and things like that. It definitely gets ambery. A lot of these Chypre fragrances will go ambery. That's another thing I forgot to mention. Typically Labdanum is featured as a note in Chypre fragrances, and I feel like a lot of these do have the Labdanum even though they don't mention it. So LOUBIFUNK at number 11, that's from the house of Christian Louboutin. Moving on to the house of Dear Diary. This is Longevity of Life. Do you guys know this particular house? This is a sister house to Maître Parfumeur Gantier, whereas they've created 7 different fragrances, amber focused, amber prominent, but in different styles and genres. So this particular fragrance is very amber forward, but it's also a rose Chypre. Lots of rose here with lots of oak moss and patchouli, with Ylang-Ylang, there's jasmine, there's vetiver, there's musk, black pepper, sandalwood. Really, really intense, really, really long lasting, definitely very, very rosy, ambery, and earthy for sure. Definitely a wonderful rose Chypre from the house of Dear Diary. It's Longevity of Life. Then moving on to the house of Profumum Roma, one of the first fragrances I bought from this house, although it's the second fragrance I've ever bought from this house. I've bought plenty more since then. This is Rosei Mundi from the house of Profumum Roma. This is definitely very, very intense and thick and jammy rose patchouli, and also definitely kind of got the touches of oak moss in here as well, along with cedar and vetiver. So the rose in here is so jammy. When you're wearing it, the oiliness, because these fragrances are oily, you can feel the syrupiness of the rose, you know, hitting your hands and kind of like you rubbing it in and things like that. But it's definitely got the Chypre style, very rose forward and also very patchouli forward, and definitely very, very syrupy and ambery as well. Wonderful fragrance, very long lasting. Rosei Mundi from the house of Profumum Roma. That is at number 9. Moving on to the house of Sisley once again. This is the second and last fragrance from this house. This is Soir d'Orient. Now these two are somewhat different and then somewhat similar. They're both in the same style and utilizing similar notes, so that you're going to find those similarities. But I much prefer the Soir d'Orient over the Isia La Nuit, which is it's a little more, I guess you should say, it's not as dark as this one, even though it's called La Nuit. But this one to me is a wonderful Chypre, very classically styled with rose, incense. There's saffron, galbanum, geranium, patchouli, sandalwood. So there's leathery touches here, very aromatic and spicy. Some green touches in here as well, and very, very aromatic. But in the end, it's very, very earthy and smoky, and of course, jammy, rosy. Soir d'Orient from the house of Sisley. It's a very dark rose. I can kind of go and say something like very gothic rose, because it's got kind of like those kind of touches. I could see like a vampire wearing a lot of these dark rose fragrances. But moving on to the house of Mind Games, it's a Checkmate, this one right here. So once again, we've got something similar to Portrait of a Lady, but I wouldn't say it's identical because it's a similar idea gone in a different direction. This is a rose forward fragrance and definitely a Chypre, and it features 3 kinds of rose, I believe. There's May rose, there's Bulgarian rose, and rose along with Davana, red currants, champagne, patchouli. There's definitely probably the presence of a little bit of Oakmoss in here as well. And to me, it reminds me of kind of a more, I would say, a greener, kind of sparkling, boozy take on a Portrait of a Lady. And even though they feature lots of rose, and I feel like the rose is not so forward. So if you don't like the idea of roses, and you like the idea of like something like Portrait of a Lady, definitely check this one out. To me, I feel like even though they feature all these different kinds of roses, in the end, it doesn't kind of scream as much as like the rose in Portrait of a Lady. So Checkmate at number 7. It's a wonderful fragrance. Hopefully you guys have checked out that brand. All right, up next, it's from the house of Van Cleef & Arpels. It's Moonlight Patchouli, this one right here. So I was in London and I got to sample the Parfum version of this. It is really, really divine. I didn't buy it yet though. I'll wait for it to come here so I can pick it up from here, but it's really, really wonderful. And this version is actually quite nice as well. In the end, it's a patchouli fragrance, but it's got lots of rose. It's a dark gothic rose, once again, with suede, leather, iris. There's cacao, there's woodsy notes, some fruity notes. Just a great fragrance. Really, really lovely patchouli with rose. Definitely a wonderful rose Chypre fragrance, and a perfect fragrance to wear when it's cold outside. Really love it. It's Moonlight Patchouli. It's a dark rose in the end. It's from the house of Van Cleef & Arpels. And then moving on to the house of Diptyque, it's Eau Capitale. Eau Capitale is a really, really great release. You know, this house is very underrated. Not a lot of people talk about this house, and I really, really love Diptyque's fragrances. Of course, I love their candles as well, and they've done a great job with Eau Capitale. It's a wonderful Chypre fragrance. Lots of rose here, lots of patchouli. There's pink pepper, so it's spicy, and of course bergamot. And I feel like there's got to be some traces of Oakmoss in here, some traces of Labdanum for the ambery touches, because in the end, it does get ambery for sure when it's settling down. It's very, very earthy and very rosy. Eau Capitale from the house of Diptyque. If you guys don't know that one, do check it out. I really recommend it. But then this one is from the house of Dior, a very underrated fragrance from this house or collection. It's Gris Dior. It's a Chypre. It's a rose Chypre. Very, very earthy. Very, very the Oakmoss forward for sure, and then there's lots of patchouli in this one as well. But in the end, it's got lots of bergamot, there's cedar, there's amber and sandalwood as well. It doesn't wear as heavy, and I like that about this particular fragrance. The smell is great, a really, really one-of-a-kind smell, in that a lot of the fragrances that I've spoken about here will not remind you of this one. There's something classic about it, but again, it's a unique standout fragrance, and it's also not overwhelming, but in the end, it's a wonderful Chypre fragrance. It's Gris Dior from the house of Dior, of course, from the Privé collection. And then moving on to the house of YSL, the Les Exceptions, no, that's Mugler. The Le Vestiaire collection from the house of YSL does seem to be surprising me quite a bit, and I've got Rouge Velour at number 3. Yum. This is a yum fragrance, really delicious rose Chypre fragrance. Lots of patchouli, lots of rose once again. We've also got some pink pepper, there's jasmine, there's vetiver, there's iris, musk, and white tea. But it's intense, it's a really jammy rose, very syrupy, and of course it does settle to an amberiness in the end when it's drying down, some woods and musk as well. But they've done a great job with this particular fragrance. Rouge Velour is wonderful from this house. Not my number 1 from the house, which is Baby Cat, but that is definitely a top 5 from the Le Vestiaire collection from YSL. And then at number 2, Noir de Noir. Totally deserves the number 2 spot. This is a great smell. It's a very original fragrance, and it's also been duplicated or copied or cloned so much, but I absolutely love the way this smells. The earthiness of the Oakmoss and the patchouli and the truffle note in here is just to die for. Along with those notes, you've got rose, patchouli, there's vanilla, there's oud, saffron, and some other floral notes. Quite orgasmic smell. I think this is really one-of-a-kind smell. I used to wear so much of it, and I keep forgetting about it because it's a decanter bottle. You can't just easily grab it and spray it, so I always forget about it. It's not that easy to use, if that makes sense, but it's every time I come back to it, I smell it. It smells fantastic. And I've mentioned many times Gothic, and the idea of Gothic really comes to mind with Noir de Noir and how dark that rose is. But You know, I forgot to grab the #1 fragrance, sadly, but at #1 it is Portrait of a Lady, and I've spoken a lot about this particular fragrance, and it deserves the #1 spot. It's one of my all-time favorite fragrances, although the fact that Noir de Noir and Frederic Malle are under, you know, Estee Lauder, both of these fragrances have gotten kind of diluted and watered down, but still I really find Portrait of Lady to be a one-of-a-kind fragrance, a masterpiece to be, you know, made or created by Dominique Ropion, and it's been around for over 10 years and I still love the way it smells. But it's rose with patchouli, there's incense, there's cloves, raspberry, sandalwood, definitely has some ambery touches when it's drying down, definitely the earthiness from the patchouli, but a wonderful, wonderful fragrance from the House of Frederic Malle, Portrait of a Lady. Sorry I don't have my bottle, I didn't bring it. I am now in a different room, so it's not easy for me to go grab it and bring it back, but that is definitely my #1 fragrance. What are your thoughts on these rose Chypre fragrances, and are you a fan of this style? Do you know what are Chypre fragrances? Do let me know, put some comments down so I can find out. If there are other rose Chypre fragrances, do let me know. Also add those in the comments section for me to find out so I can check into them. Thanks so much for watching today's video, guys, and if you're watching this around Valentine's Day, happy Valentine's Day to you. If you have any questions or comments, please list below. Please like this video, please share it. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and I'll be back with more videos very soon. Have a good one. Goodbye. Alright guys, I've got 3 different bonus fragrances for you guys here that are rose Chypre fragrances. The first one is Etienne Egner's Explosive. A little tough to get now, but at one time this was very, very inexpensive and I ended up buying a bottle of it and I love it to death. It is a feminine targeted release, but I think a man can totally wear this one. It's got lots of rose and patchouli and definitely oak moss with geranium and coriander. So it's got some spicy touches, woody touches, aldehydic touches, but in the end it's rose, patchouli, and oak moss. Great, great combination. So Explosive is the first bonus fragrance. And then we've got the Rammstein fragrance Rosenrot Intense, another rose Chypre fragrance, and this is one that I've spoken quite a bit about as well. It's got metallic notes with roses, there's incense, there's green notes, cashmere wood, sandalwood, and grapefruit. But a great inexpensive, if you can find it, it's easier to get in Germany, but very inexpensive. It's under 50 pounds, like not pounds, it should be euros because it's euros there. But it's under 50 euros and it's just a great fragrance for the price. Really wonderful job and a great, great rose Chypre fragrance, Rosenrot Intense from the house of Rammstein. Last but not least, this one's definitely very, very inexpensive. You can still find plenty of it. It's Lalique's Perle de Lalique. This one to me does have similarities to Portrait of a Lady. Features notes of Bulgarian rose, bourbon pepper, patchouli, cashmere wood, and most likely it's got some labdanum and it's got some oak moss and some bergamot in there as well to give you that kind of a rose Chypre styling. Anyway, Perles de Lalique, 3 bonuses. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.